if you read through the prophecies that are given to us in the Old Testament, there's a lot of doom and gloom in there, a lot of destruction of Israel, a lot of destruction of nations surrounding Israel, right? We talk about the destruction of Babylon and the falling of Babylon and things like that. God has the final say in demonstrating that he's going to establish righteousness in the earth. He's not going to allow his plans to be thwarted, no matter how evil and wicked things get in the world, right? When Antichrist finally comes to power, and at the midpoint of the week, he shows who he truly is, not just to Israel, but to the rest of the world, demands worldwide worship, implements the mark of the beast, and forbids anyone from buying and selling unless they have the mark and worship him and worship them and take the mark. And he's going to be persecuting Christians and anyone who opposes him, Jewish people. He goes out to make war with the saints and overcome them. He's even going to be there's going to be a great tribulation at that time that will surpass anything that's ever happened in the world up to that point, if we take Yeshua's words literally and factually. And so this will be the time of Jacob's trouble, but it'll also be the time of trouble where the entire world is teetering and tottering back and forth. We read about some of the language in the prophecies. The point I'm bringing up is that no matter how bad it gets in the world with the demonic deception and the great falling away that Paul talks about in his Thessalonian chapter books, letters, no matter how bad it gets, like we're going to read about in the book of Revelation with all the plagues and the locusts and the fire and the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, all of that is going to come to a conclusion when Yeshua establishes his kingdom on earth physically. Right, bodily here, like we read about, like we saw in the vision of the statue where the stone strikes the statue at the feet, at the toe level, at that stage. That gives us kind of an indicator of the timing that we're looking at. The stone strikes the statue, not at the head or the chest or in the midsection, but on the toe section, right when the last final beast empire is in power, when the 10-nation coalition is in power, when the Antichrist is thinking that he probably cannot be equaled or rivaled or defeated. God's going to sorely disappoint him. Likewise, in Daniel's vision of the beasts, when the one like the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days, it's during the stages of that last great dreadful beast who tramples the entire earth, and the time of the 10 horns and the little horn who plucks out 3 before him, right? That's the time frame that we're looking at. So it's not all doom and gloom, is the point I'm trying to say. And we talked about this last week. The only way that we are going to make it as humans, right, on this time period, because we can't withstand the onslaught of Antichrist on our own as human beings. The only way we're going to be able to make it is if we cling to the one who has defeated death itself, the only one who is the true champion in God's playbook, and that is his son Messiah Yeshua. You've got to know him. You've got to have a relationship with him. Let's keep going through our slides here. So with these details before us, there are, in my opinion, a few questions that naturally come to mind concerning Daniel's prophecy. Let's take the last, say, 10, 15 minutes to look at the final slides. We're basically on slide 53 of 80. I don't think we'll make it through all of the slides. Obviously, we'll keep going with this. I'm not rushing the material, but let's get into some of these questions that I've put together. First questions. These are in no particular order. These are just questions that I found relevant for this type of study. Question. First, why is this prophecy important, and what is the relevancy? What is the relevance to the church and to end times, right? These are questions you might have as a Christian or even as a non-Christian, right? Here's an answer that I have come up with. It's not the final answer, and you could probably come up with a better answer, but this is the answer that I have put together. So notice that the font is not italics anymore. That means these are my own thoughts. This is a study I put together 20 years ago, right? And then I had to kind of rework it and retool it for this study here in 2023. But most of it's still the same. So the question is, why is this prophecy important that we read about in Daniel, and what's the relevance to the church and to end times? Answer. Jesus' disciples asked him what would be the sign of the end of the age and the sign of his return in Matthew 24, which is known as the Olivet Discourse. We'll get to that in time, remember? Jesus replied by telling them what to expect. And so he gives them some things to look forward to, not necessarily things that you would want to happen. When I say look forward to, not in a good sense, but negative things that are going to be happening, but nevertheless, you can watch for them, right? false Christs, wars, rumors of wars, desolation, famine, persecution, going along with the same question. And then he refers to the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, right? Matthew 24:15. So all of this language that Jesus warned us about, that the Messiah gave us in advance, gives us this sense of, we might not know the exact timing of the events, but at least we can discern the season. We can discern the kind of the sentiments of the age, the signs that precede what's really coming down the pike. The point that I'm highlighting is that he didn't just say to his disciples, well, don't worry about it. When it happens, it's going to happen, and you guys just need to be ready. No, he actually answered their question in a very, very detailed way. We'll see when we get to those chapters in Matthew and Mark and in Luke. In bold, I write these notes. Understand, Jesus was telling the disciples what would transpire just prior to his return, and specifically mentions the events of Daniel 9:27. So that's very, very important. Here's another question that came to my mind that I hope that you're considering the answer to as well. Question: if the 70th week is yet to be fulfilled, like I believe it is from a futurist perspective, why is there such a long gap between the 69th and the 70th weeks? Again, this is a question whose answer is really open for discussion with the preterists, those who believe there isn't really a gap. So listen to my answer, or an answer that might sound similar to what other futurists would also add or lend to the table. Consider what has transpired in the intervening years. The Jews were dispersed to wander without a home for nearly 19 centuries, but in that same time period, the Church of Jesus Christ was established among the Gentiles. Shaul speaks of this at length in Romans chapters 9 through 11. So, continuing along with this question about why is there a gap, notice what Paul says in Romans, quote, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." So what I have to say, continuing along with this particular answer about why the gap, when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, this phrase that Paul introduced into his book, the veil of blindness will be lifted from Israel's eyes, and the remnant of Israel will be saved in Jesus the Messiah. So we're talking about, when we go back over to that chart about the gap, the church age, it's a time that is dominated not really by Israel as a people group, but rather by the Gentiles as people. And this is why we have confidence that there is a gap, because we know from hindsight and from reading through other New Testament passages that there is this mystery of the Gentile inclusion into the people of God as Gentiles. It was not really a mystery that the Gentiles would be included in God's people. That really was told all the way back to Abraham, when God said, "I will bless those that bless you, curse those that curse you, and through you all the nations," i.e. Gentiles, goyim, people groups around you, the peoples of the world, "through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Genesis chapter 12. So we know that the Gentiles would always have a place in God's economy and in God's people, but the mystery was, how would they fit in? According to Israel, and the mystery, and I'll put a little graphic on the screen to show this, according to national Israel's speculation, according to their figuring out of things, Gentiles would come into Israel via conversion. They would have to change their status from Gentile, become a Jew, and they would join the people group as Jews. So thus, the people of God would always really be composed and comprised of Jewish peoples, whether you're natural born or convert, but either way, you're Jewish. That was their perspective, at least as it came to be articulated in the first century and later, or the first few centuries before the first century, following the Maccabean period and going forward with the first forced physical circumcision and things like that. So they were really confused by physical circumcision, the act of circumcision, turning a person into a Jew, etc., etc. But Paul was given the revelation that no, that's not the way the Gentiles are to be included into the people group of God. It's a mystery to Israel. They were blinded to that. God knew of it. It was a mystery to the Jewish people, but it was not a mystery to God. So that's why Paul says that when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, meaning the full measure of the people that God has determined are going to be joining the family of God. After that takes place, then the veil of blindness on Israel will be lifted from her eyes, and the remnant of Israel will be saved in Jesus the Messiah, i.e., as we work our way towards the culmination of the end of the age, then Israel's blindness will be removed. I continue. The fullness of the Gentiles will come in, and the blindness of Israel's remnant will be lifted during the second half of Daniel's 70th week. And that's a very important event for us to look forward to. Let's continue with the particular questions that I formulated. How do we know the first seals of the first seals of Revelation 6 are within the 70th week of Daniel? So we're talking about questions that arise when you have a study on the 70th week, the final 7-year slice of history that is primarily given over to humanity. How do we know that the first seals of Revelation are within? For instance, when I listen to Bible preachers today, prophecy teachers, many of them are fond of saying, well, we don't have to say that all of the seals are in the 70th week. Maybe, because we'd have wars and rumors of wars, false Christ, we've had earthquakes in diverse places, we've had all kinds of political unrest, religious persecution going on for thousands of years, right? And especially in the church age, the church has been persecuted for the last 1900 years or so. So why do we have to smash everything or collect everything into the final 7 years? Okay. That's a good question. And my understanding as an end times Bible prophecy buff and a futurist is that most of the concentrated events will take place in the 70th week, and there's good reason for it. Here's my answer. Let's take a look at a chart to remind us what the 7 seals of Revelation chapter 6 entail. Afterwards, we will label each seal and place all 7 into Daniel's final week of 7 years. So I'm not going to bring up a reading of the book of Revelation. We'll get to that in time, but just be aware that in the book of Revelation, the writer, which is John, the Revelator, he's shown by Yeshua several visions with several details, and among them, there are 7, in this order, there are 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And these seals, trumpets, and bowls describe different events that unfold before John's eyes in apocalyptic fashion, in symbolic fashion, in visionary fashion, but they correspond to events that will take place on earth. And I believe that there is what we might call a chronology to it. In other words, when we read the book of Revelation in its most natural, literal, historical, grammatical sense, there's a chronology to the book of Revelation. And so in this chart that I've got in front of you, it's a very simple chart. There are 7 seals of the book of Revelation, and we can see, reading from left to right, there's the white horse for seal 1. There's the red horse for seal 2. There's a black horse for seal 3. And then there's a pale horse for seal 4. We call these the 4 horses of the apocalypse or something to that effect. And then in the 5th seal, we have the souls crying out, souls under the altar crying out for vengeance from God to avenge their blood. This is what we might call the great martyrdom on planet Earth at that time, the 5th seal. And then moving from left to right, we have these earthquake on the earth, sun, moon, and stars losing their brilliance, right? These, what we might call the cosmic disturbances in seal 6. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The final one is silence in heaven. Shh. Right? You see the guy with his finger saying, shh, let's be quiet. So these are the 7 seals of the book of Revelation. Well, how do they correspond with the book of Daniel? Let's go back to our question and answer. How do we know the first seals of Revelation 6 are within the 70th week of Daniel? Well, according to my understanding of the timing of these events, when we place these events into Daniel's final 70th week of years, which is still future, the 7 seals look like this. And this is according to, again, a premillennial, pre-wrath model. So let's bring in one more chart. This time, we've got the 70th week of Daniel in this particular chart. This is in agreement with a premillennial, pre-wrath. And notice we've got the full 7 years indicated by a green slice that says 7 years there. And then underneath that, it's broken down into the 3.5 years and the 3.5 years at the beginning and at the end. So look at the very bottom of the chart. We've got the first seal, which is Antichrist. The second seal, which is World War. Remember the horses, right? We had the white horse at the very beginning. That's Antichrist. And then the second seal, which was the red horse, is world war. The third seal, which was the black horse, is famine. And then the fourth seal, which was the kind of the pale horse, kind of an eggshell white or something that effect, pale horse, is mass death. And then we got the midpoint. So this is a kind of a rough chronology, according to my understanding of not just the 70th week of Daniel, but eventually we'll see how this fits in with the book of Revelation in more detail. And then continuing, going from left to right, in other words, chronologically moving forward, the fifth seal, where we have the people under the altar crying out to God, that's the martyred dead who are now asking God to avenge their deaths. And then we get to the sixth seal, which was the cosmic disturbances in the sun, the moon, and the stars, the earthquakes on earth and things like that. But primarily it's the signs in the sky. And then notice this chart doesn't have the seventh seal, which is basically, well, I mean, it does, but it's up above. The seventh seal, which was the silence in heaven, which begins the initiation of, according to this chart, the trumpets plus the bowls. Basically, kind of giving you a little bit of sneak preview as we're drawing this study to a close tonight. We'll pick this up next week with some more questions. Basically, as far as I can ascertain, of the seven seals that are broken in the book of Revelation, the seventh seal itself contains or signifies the beginning of the seven trumpets, which will be sounded. And then when we get to the seventh trumpet itself, it actually signals the beginning of the seven bowls. So in that perspective, we could say that all of the bowls are contained, the seven bowls are contained within the seventh trumpet, and all the trumpets are contained within the seventh seal itself, something to that effect. But it still plays itself out chronologically. Look at the top of the chart. At the beginning of this last 7 years, according to my understanding as a pre-mill, pre-trib, Antichrist makes a covenant, or he strengthens a covenant. Again, the language can go either way. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes his own brand new covenant with his own proprietary language, his own wording that suits his agendas. Could be that he creates and drafts a covenant that's not on the books, but I wouldn't be surprised if he simply just reuses one that's already available. So he makes a covenant very early on, and that signifies the beginning of the 70th year, the 70th week in earnest, or in what we could say in specific, right? We might not know that it begins until we get into the 3-year period, but then retroactive, we're like, wow, this has been going on for 3.5 years. In other words, when the abomination of desolation takes place, which Yeshua highlighted, and I'm saying this in closing, so it must be something that's not secret. Remember, the disciples ask him, what are going to be the signs of the end of the age and your return? And Yeshua gives them all of these beginnings of birth pangs, the seals 1 through 4, etc. But then Yeshua switches his language to indicate that there's going to be this midpoint event that should really grab your attention, because when we get to the book of Luke, we're going to find out that at that same midpoint, that Jerusalem is going to find herself surrounded by her armies. In fact, I believe Antichrist will already have his armies parked there in Jerusalem as a sign of saying, hey, we're here to protect you. But in reality, it's just going to turn the guns, swing them 180 degrees, and point them at Jerusalem instead of away from Israel towards Israel's enemies, right? But it'd be easy if Antichrist was already occupying Jerusalem peacefully for the first 3.5 years until he finally takes his mask off and just turns the guns towards Israel and begins his persecution of Israel and destroying Jerusalem, etc., etc. So Antichrist makes a covenant. So we might not know when the covenant starts, right? That might be kind of secretive or whatever. But we can definitely say, I believe with certainty, when the midpoint event takes place. That's my understanding. I could be wrong, but the fact that Yeshua highlighted it and brought it to the disciples' attention, and the fact that we have a forerunner in Antiochus Epiphanes, which we're going to look at in time, where he desecrated the temple, and that's a momentous event. The fact that we have all of that information and perspective leads me to the impression that this is not something that will be secretive. So the abomination of desolation is right there in the middle. And then looking at the top of the chart and in closing, we have the coming of the Son of Man, date unknown, meaning sometime after the Great Tribulation starts, but before the 7-year ends, before the final 3.5 years, we have the coming of the Son of Man, meaning the rapture takes place, where God allows Yeshua to snatch away the church from planet Earth to protect her from completely being wiped out. In fact, Yeshua describes it somewhere along the lines of that, unless those days were shortened, there would no flesh be saved, right? I don't think he's shortening the 3.5 years or the 7 years. I think in context, what he's talking about, unless the days of persecution, the days of tribulation are shortened. And then final on the very top of the chart. So we have the coming of the Son of Man, which is the rapture. And then we have Jesus' reign in Jerusalem beginning at the far end, the far right of the chart, where that yellow arrow is pointing off to the right. So don't get confused, the second coming of Christ with the rapture of the saints. Don't get those two events confused. The rapture of the saints is Yeshua gathering us and collecting us, and we get snatched away and we go up. But the second coming of Messiah is where we come back down. The saints go up and the wrath comes down, right? So we'll talk about these in more detail. We have some more questions and answers. We'll continue to look at this question here about how do we know that the first seals of Revelation 6 are within the 70th week of Daniel? And we'll continue looking at this question. But that'll do it now for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.